Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University. Now, most people that follow this channel do it for, most likely, do it for my different types of Pokemon biology videos. And most people know that I'm also a geologist because, paleontology is basically the sort of child of biology and geology, and paleontology is what I do. However, what a lot of people might not know is that I'm actually, I spend a lot of time and a lot of my thoughts on different parts of technology as well. For example, I built this PC that I produce all of my content on, and if you remember back in this video, I made this little guy, which is, it looks like a Game Boy Micro, but it's essentially a little tiny emulating PC. And granted, when it's this small, it can only be so powerful, but it can emulate Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games very easily. And I know I built it myself, and it cost all of $25 to $30 to do. And but like I said, I built it myself, and it functions really, really well. And also, if you remember back to this video, I talked about some fake Pokemon games that I bought off of Facebook Marketplace because I didn't know really what I was looking for. I thought that I knew, but I should have known better. In fact, I've got those games still right here. I got, well, 2 copies of Leaf Green, and a copy of Fire Red. And I bought them because I thought, getting 3 games I bought them for $75. I'm like, these 3 games for $75? Cool. I'll sell one of the Leaf Greens for like $30 or $40 because they can usually be found for more expensive than that. And then so I got a copy of Fire Red and Leaf Green for $30, $40, which is a great price. However, like I said, they turned out to be counterfeit, and in the video I sort of show you how you can tell the difference. And now for this video I wanted to talk a little bit about how to do that with Game Boy games, Game Boy Color games, but also just some of the interesting aspects comparing some games. So if you have some older Game Boy games, particularly Game Boy Color or regular Game Boy games, you can go ahead and pull them out. If you have some way to get them open, that is, if you want to do this along with me, so A, you can double check if your games are legitimate, and B, you can just sort of see what I'm talking about. So it'd be really helpful if you had something like this, which is a screwdriver that I got off of Amazon, and actually got a 2-pack. Let me find the other one. Here you are. So I actually bought these actually to get into the insides of a Nintendo 64 that I have, because I wanted to tinker around with the inside of that. But you can buy a 2-pack that work on these screws. One of them works on these screws on the back of the actual games. And then this other one that I got, there's the same types of screws but larger on the actual console itself of the Nintendo 64. So I bought a 2-pack just to get inside of it. So if you have one of these, that'd be super helpful. Or if you don't, this will work in a pinch. This is one that I made years ago, but I still have it. It doesn't really work, but I have yet to throw it away since I bought this. But basically, if you take sort of the end of a pen, you take a pen apart, and you have like the little clicky end. Let me pull that out. If you melt it down and, get it so the plastic does not burn, but it melts, and then while it is still hot, press it into like the screw part of your game. And while, yeah, it can get a little bit of plastic around the game, but like, if you want to get it open, you're probably not all that concerned about it, since opening these in general and toying around with them has a general risk of damaging them. So again, at your own risk. But that's something you can do in an emergency, is do that instead of, if you don't have one of these fancy screwdrivers. And what I mean by different types of games is, just between, say, Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games, and also between American or North American, I don't know how they distributed them back in the day, and Japanese games, because I did a little bit of freelance writing to pick up some money, because I saw on Facebook Marketplace that somebody was selling a lot of 5 authentic Japanese games, which it includes all of the Generation 1 games. So if you did not know, here it was released red and blue, and then yellow were the Generation 1 games, but in Japan it was actually released red and green, and then blue with, updated Pokemon sprites, and then yellow. So there are 4 Generation 1 games in Japan. So included all of those, as well as an authentic copy of Pokemon Crystal, that is Japanese, which I mostly bought to go with that Game Boy right there, because they were released together. That is a Japan-only console, and it was released with this game. It's got Celebi on it. If you remember back to this video where I talk about it, yeah, it was released with Pokemon Crystal, and I thought it should be reunited with the Japanese Pokemon Crystal version, but also just looking at the back, that is super pretty. That is not a pattern on the cartridge, that is on the circuit board itself, and I think that's super cool. So I'm going to go ahead and take these apart and sort of show you the difference between the two, and it's interesting. So I actually had a copy of Pokemon Green from years ago. I asked my mom for it for my birthday for 1 year, just because I was like, it's super cool. It's a Japan exclusive Pokemon game from, at that point, probably not quite 20 years ago, but close. And my mom got it for me. And interestingly, there are some differences, even though they are both guaranteed authentic, between the Pokemon Green that I had before and this Pokemon Green. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and pop these open and poke around a little bit. Okay, so let's start with the two Pokemon Red versions. I really wish I had some sort of camera to do like a top-down shot on, but unfortunately I don't. So I'm just going to throw up some pictures after I get these open and talk about them while the picture's on the screen for you all. So those pictures should be up on the screen, so let's talk about them. First of all, how to identify a fake one? Well, if you've already got it in your hand and you're taking it apart, it's a little late, but you know, if you're ever buying something, especially off of something where you can message the seller, like Facebook Marketplace, ask for them to open it up. Because almost certainly, and it's not a guarantee, but if it has a battery inside, that is a very good tell that it is genuine. Alright, so comparing the North American version of Red to the Japanese version of Red, there's some really interesting things. So number one, the first thing that I noticed is the battery is much, much smaller in the Japanese version of Red, which explains why, you know, when I got this, when it arrived, it would not save, so I will have to change this out apparently. Which is way easier to do than a lot of people think. You can do it without soldering, although you really should really should solder if you change your batteries, just because it's actually way safer for your game, presuming you know what you're doing, and it'll make your game just last way longer because it's a lot less wear and tear on the board. I made that mistake in that you'll see with my copy of Pokemon Gold that I'm going to show you. I used electrical tape, and now I can't get it off. Anyway, so the next thing that I noticed is that the Japanese version of Red has these weird, I would assume that they're resistors, and that sort of becomes a common theme in that the Japanese version has these weird gaps for, again, what I assume to be resistors. I'm not that familiar with electronics, but I'm almost positive that those are resistors, and I don't know what they do specifically. I tried to figure it out, and I don't know what they do. And we'll talk about them more when we get to the two versions of Pokemon Green that I have. But yeah, I'm really just curious about the purpose that they serve. Alright, so let's look at some of the parts on here, some of the actual parts besides the battery and those little resistors. So you see both of these have 4, black chips, and each one of those does something different, and while they're laid out differently between each of them, they should do roughly the same things. I was only able to find a really good explanation for these for the North American ones, but I would assume that the Japanese one is pretty similar. The largest one, the one that's directly beneath the battery, is where the ROM is stored, the actual game files themselves. So essentially that's a little piece of almost like a flash drive, more or less. It's a very primitive, very early form of flash drive, and considering how large that is, let me actually look how large the file sizes for these games are. Yeah, so Pokemon Red's ROM file is roughly 1 megabyte, which could be stored on something incredibly, incredibly small these days, but back in almost 25 years ago now, 2021 will be the 25th anniversary of Pokemon, that's the kind of size you needed to store 1 megabyte of data. So the one to the left, in the North American one, it's the second largest one, but in the Japanese one, there's 2 that are roughly the same size. But the one that is sort of facing up and down along with that ROM one is where your saves are stored. That's basically the RAM. And so the battery is needed here because it doesn't save them in the same way. And the reason it does this is because the cartridge doesn't need to ever overwrite the ROM files, because without being tampered with, those will never change. And so the reason why the battery is needed for the RAM, and RAM is volatile memory, meaning that it needs power to maintain its information, which is why you have the battery there. If you think of like the RAM in your computer, anytime you turn your computer off, the RAM in your computer anything in it gets deleted. And it works the same here. Now on the North American one, it's the next smallest, so the larger of the two perfectly square ones. I don't actually know what that is. I want to say that is sort of like the master controller, because basically every other piece has circuits, and that's what all these lines on the circuit board are. They're connections from one component to the next. And so I would assume, because it's just labeled in the thing that I'm looking at called MBC3, I would assume that means that this is sort of the master control of everything. And that would make sense why it's a little bigger in the Japanese one, because they came out almost a year, maybe 2 years before they did in North America. So in that time, the technology might have improved a little bit, so they could downsize it a little. And then finally, the smallest one is called the RAM protector in this diagram that I am looking at. And basically what that does is, I would assume that it prevents too much electricity from being run into where your saves are stored. Although that is just a guess based on the name and a little bit based off of some of these circuitry. Alright, so next we're going to be talking about what I think is the most interesting one, and that I'm going to be talking about two different copies of the same game from the same, in the same language. So these are the new copy of Pokemon Green that I just got with this lot that I bought, and the older one that I've had for a couple years now. So, going back and talking about the, let's break it down. So it is almost exactly the same. They are all the same with one exception. The Japanese one, which will be on the right. Well, I guess they're both Japanese. But the newer one, I should say, will be on the right. Looks exactly the same as that Japanese Pokemon Red version that I just showed you. However, what is not the same is the one that I've had for a while, in that there's one thing different. Well, I should say one main thing different. It looks like the chips, mainly the ROM and RAM chips, look different. Different companies who get these things in bulk, these components, they get them from different suppliers. And so I would say whatever factory was making these just got them from different suppliers, so they have a bit different branding on each of them. But they functionally do the same thing. The thing that I'm most curious about, because I still don't really know what they do, are those resistors. And that they're present in the newer Japanese copy, just like they were in the Japanese Red copy, but they are absent in the copy that I've had for a couple years, and I have no idea why. There's literally zero sign that they were ever even there to begin with. And I've played this game, obviously not a ton because I don't know Japanese, but I've played this game, and it saved at the time. It does no longer because the battery has since died. But it no longer saves, but it still works, And so I'm really, really curious as to what the purpose of those resistors are. Next, I'll talk just very, very quickly about Pokemon Yellow. So one really interesting thing is that they seem to have swapped the battery size, in that the Japanese copy of Yellow got a bigger battery, about the same size as what we saw in Pokemon Red. But the North American copy of Yellow got a smaller battery, the same size as we saw in the Japanese version of Red. Which is really, really interesting. I have no idea why they would do that, because that means that the save in Pokemon Yellow lasts shorter than it does in Pokemon Red. And it looks like they added one thing that's kind of new. However, it doesn't take up that much space. So I really am not sure why they chose to do that. And also that same thing, appears to be on the Japanese copy. So I don't know why they would choose to do that in a way that would make it so they, made the battery shorter, or made the battery life shorter. Let's move on to the last, and in my opinion, the most interesting of all of these, the Pokemon Crystal PCBs. I don't think I've actually used that term yet. So PCB is basically the term for circuit board without the attachments. So it's basically the actual board itself and not any of the actual parts attached to it. I guess in this case, it is the parts that kind of make it interesting. Anywho, it is basically the same as what we saw in the Generation 1 games. However, well, as you can see, number one, my North American copy of Crystal is missing the battery because that is one that I did myself with duct tape. And the way I did it was not very smart in that it caused too much pressure on the front plate, and it didn't like crack it, but it put too much pressure on it, and you can tell that it was pushed on a little too hard in one spot, which is unfortunate. Plus these contacts just look awful and are probably not very good for maintaining a save. So in my opinion, if you're going to replace batteries, just buy the attached ones, because you can see on the copy on the right, the Japanese copy, that the contacts are kind of like riveted almost to the battery. And you can buy them pre-done like that, so you can solder them in. It takes 2 seconds to solder, and it's really not that hard to solder it in. But I would absolutely recommend doing that instead of just duct taping or electrical taping over your battery. Something that I find really interesting, though, is that for some reason they decided to make the Crystal copy look pretty, or the Japanese copy of Crystal look pretty. And I get why. It was arguably the best Pokemon game thus far. Crystal is an extremely good game, a very highly valued game to this day, and so I get wanting to spend that much time. However, they only did it for the Japanese copy, not the North American copy. And so they put the screws on the outside instead of through the middle of the board in order to, I guess, make it look more symmetrical. All of the same, really important components are, there in both. They have this new, really interesting, what I assume is a resistor up in the top left corner. Although with that tape on it, I don't actually know, and it's kind of hard to tell. But they took a lot of care in placing things in, and obviously they do with every circuit board, but in planning for the Japanese copy, they took a lot of extra care because you can't actually see all of the connection paths from one thing to the next, because they coated the PCB in some kind of coating to make it look pretty, so it's not just this, kind of ugly computer green color. Only in very, specific areas, if you hold it up to the light, can you actually see any of the connections between all of the pieces. And the reason that they probably did that was the back of the PCB. So in genuine Japanese copies of Pokemon Crystal, the PCB has, Suicune's, basically Suicune's symbol on it. The crystal / ornamentation that is on Suicune's head. And this is why Japanese copies of Crystal are, in my opinion, way more valuable, although they sell for way less than North American copies of Crystal. That and the cover art for the Japanese version, I think, is just much, much prettier. So I really don't understand why the North American copies can sell for, upward of $60, $70, where the Japanese copies sell for only like anywhere from, I've seen them as low as 10, but you can find them for typically around 20. So what was the whole point of this video? Well, number one, I want it to be a resource for you to look back if you ever want to buy one of these games, to look back and, here's a variety of games. And granted, you can just Google it. But if you ever want to buy one of these games, I would appreciate you coming back and rewatching this video for reference for what a real one looks like. And this is what all of these copies are 100% genuine. But it was also just partially an excuse for me to nerd out about computer things that I really, really enjoy doing. Because, I don't know, it's just not something that I get to do all that often. Most of my friends are not all that tech savvy, so I don't really get to talk computers with them. And these are the same basic parts that are on basically every computer, you know, including like a computer that I have sitting next to me that I'm recording this video on. You know, it has, you know, a chip for the ROM of this type of computer. And while it's not a game file, it is the file that sort of tells, you know, the motherboard which parts do what, how, the settings essentially for each of the parts that do what they do. That's a really poor explanation, but that's the only way that I could think to explain it right now. But there's a ROM file in the motherboard of every computer. There's even a little bit of RAM on each motherboard computer. And, you know, you don't ever hear about them running out because, you know, who's going to be using a computer, you know, the same computer for like 15 years, especially these days? Very few people. But there is actually a way to do that, and that there's these two little prongs. There's even a battery that keeps it. And so you actually drain it if you want to like reset some of your settings. You like connect it with a screwdriver or something, the two prongs, and it sort of like shorts it in a way that resets the RAM that your settings are saved to. Not all of your, you know, personal settings in Windows, but some of your settings, you know, within the actual like coding type stuff of the computer if you tend to mess around with that kind of thing like I do. And I also wanted to make this video to let you all know that some of these games are going to be for sale. And, you know, like I said, the whole reason that I bought it was for that Japanese copy of Crystal. But the other 4 games, the Pokemon copies, or Japanese copies of Red, Blue, Yellow, and Green, are all going to be for sale. And I'm going to be putting them on eBay probably later this week, not today, because I want to give you all time if you would like them. And I'm totally open to pricing. I'm not going to be like, oh, you have it for $1 or $5, but I'm not going to like try and, you know, cost you an arm and a leg. I would prefer a DM on Twitter, actually, if you're interested, where you can follow me as well, where you should follow me at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science. As well as if you are interested, we do have a Patreon down in the description as well. And as always, a massive, massive, massive shout out to our supporter over on Patreon, Patty. Thank you so much. And lastly, thank you so much for watching. And I guess, as always, there's a time and place for everything.